Why do you still feel lost even after listening to every voice around you? He walked the streets like someone crossing an invisible battlefield. Each face, a siren. Each screen, a thunderclap. Every opinion, a current trying to drag him into a river that wasn't his. They called it staying informed, but all he felt was the weight of carrying 1,000 voices that weren't his own. Even silence had become noisy. And somewhere between the traffic lights and the shouting, a doubt began to grow inside him. What if the world had gone mad and no one noticed? That morning, while everyone rushed, he stopped in front of a closed shop window. Inside, an old clock stood still. The unmoving hands seemed to mock the tempo outside. He stood there for long minutes, listening to something that came from nowhere. A soft sound, internal, like the echo of a forgotten memory. It wasn't an answer, nor a command, just a voiceless calling, like a breeze drifting through an empty room. For the first time in months, he didn't feel the urge to keep moving. He didn't know it yet, but that moment would become a mirror. Not the kind that shows your face, the kind that reveals the noise inside. He realized, without thinking, that the loudest scream wasn't from people. It came from his own fear of not belonging. And when that fear paused for a second, everything around him sank into cotton. It was as if the world had been wrapped in a thick blanket. Cars passed, voices rose, but he could hear only the rhythmic beating of his own chest. For the first time, he didn't try to interpret. He just stayed. And instead of chasing answers, he quietly asked how many years he had spent trying to prove he was present, while his soul silently begged to be left alone. Maybe true silence isn't the absence of sound, but the end of the effort to be someone in the middle of all the noise. It was an unlikely place, the kind no one really notices. A small house tucked between two tall modern buildings, like a forgotten secret among loud voices. The door was faded wood, the glass smudged with time, and a tiny bell that no longer rang. He passed by without knowing why he stopped. There was no sign of life, only a quiet presence, as if the space itself refused to be swallowed by the world. Without fully deciding, he pushed the door. It opened with the gentlest creak he'd ever heard. Inside, the air was dense but not heavy, the kind of density that holds you, not burdens you. Everything was covered in a thin film of time. Stacked books, a worn-out sofa, a cup with traces of dried tea. No noise, no urgency. Just the sound of wind lightly touching the windows. And for the first time, he realized he was in a place where no one needed to convince him of anything. In the center of the room, a rocking chair faced a blank wall. No television, no painting, just empty space. He sat down as if accepting an invitation he didn't understand. And he stayed. His body tried to stir, his thoughts tried to flee. But something older, deeper began to rise. Like water that had always been there beneath the crust of demands and opinions. It felt strange. He no longer wanted to understand. He just wanted to stay. Outside, voices carried on. The traffic, the debates, the mechanical sounds of a restless world. But inside that house, something sweet as incense began to form. He didn't need to be useful. He didn't need to take a stand. He didn't need to win. There he could just breathe. And that was enough. Then a thought whispered without words. How many times does the soul withdraw not out of weakness but wisdom? How often does it choose to be silent, not out of fear, but because it knows some things only bloom in the dark? At the edge of the room stood a small glass cabinet, almost invisible in the dim light. He approached it without purpose, as if not searching, yet somehow finding. Inside was a collection of nameless things. A dark crow's feather, a used matchbox, a cracked mirror, a melted piece of candle. Objects that no longer serve the world but seem to hold entire stories. He looked at them the way you recognize old friends you've lost touch with, yet whose presence still warms something inside you. Then he saw a small notebook with a coarse, untitled cover. He opened it without expectation, but each page held just one sentence, written in slow, curved handwriting, as if composed by someone who already knew they wouldn't be heard. One sentence per page. silences between them, like pauses between breaths. He read one. The loudest sound you'll ever hear is your mind trying to run from itself. Then another. Not every battle needs a witness. Some victories happen when you choose not to answer. He sat back in the rocking chair, placed the notebook on his lap and stayed there just reading. Not to learn, but to forget a little. Each sentence felt like a grain of sand dropped into a glass of water, light, yet transforming. There were no teachings, only reminders of things he once knew and had forgotten. He realized he was crying, not from sorrow, but from recognition. It was a kind of homesickness for himself, a version of him that didn't need to explain anything. The tears didn't fall from pain, but from cleansing, as if they were washing off the residue of an ancient noise he'd been carrying unknowingly. It was as if his soul, after so long, had found a porch where it could sit in silence and simply watch, without needing to fix or defend anything. And there, among phrases written by no one he understood, not every scream is a calling. Some are just echoes trying to survive. And he didn't need to echo back. Some places don't exist on any map, but they find us the moment we stop searching. The next morning he left the house like someone waking from a lucid dream. The world remained unchanged in its urgency, but something inside him had shifted. The streets were the same, the faces, the noise. Everything still screamed. But now, he walked like someone who no longer needed to respond to every sound, every question, every demand for presence. Without knowing how, he had learned the art of not replying. On the crowded bus, two strangers argued politics with clenched teeth and pointed fingers. He felt the old urge to intervene, but didn't. He just breathed and observed. In the past, he might have jumped in, proved something, won some imaginary argument. But now, something deep inside him smiled. A quiet that no longer sought approval or audience. The silence within him was not retreat. It was shield. At work, he noticed how everyone spoke over each other. They tried to outvolume one another as if listening was a threat. For the first time, he heard it all without getting lost. Let the words pass through him like wind through the open windows of an old house. He didn't need to hold anything. And then it struck him. True silence wasn't the lack of noise. It was the space where no voice could pull him away from himself. During a break, he locked himself in a bathroom stall. Not for physical need, but for solitude. He took out the notebook, now carried like a secret talisman, and read another line. Inner quiet is the only way to hear what the world hasn't yet learned to say. And in that cramped little space, something vast opened within him. A realization. This peace might not last forever, but it existed. And more than that, it could be returned to again and again. All it took was not answering. Not every noise is an invitation. Sometimes it's just the world's desperation not to hear its own emptiness. At the end of the day, walking home, he passed a group of people arguing loudly. He recognized one face, his sister, and she saw him, called out with urgency like someone summoning a soldier to battle. He hesitated, felt his legs nearly betray him with the old impulse to please, to explain, to justify his calm, his absence, his choice not to take sides. But something in his chest whispered firmly, "Don't go." And for the first time, he obeyed that whisper. There was no rejection in his gesture, no pride, just reverence for a new inner border he had begun to build. He kept walking, and as he turned the corner, something broke, not between him and his sister, but between him and the need to be accepted. It was a soft grief, like letting go of a mask worn too long. He realized silence sometimes takes more courage than speaking, and that some bonds survive only when space is honored between two inner worlds. In the near-empty park, he sat on a stone bench, took out the notebook but didn't open it, just held it. His fingers touched the rough cover like the skin of someone dearly missed. And then he remembered his grandmother, a woman who rarely spoke. As a child, he thought her silence meant weakness. Today, he understood. She simply didn't waste words where silence spoke more. He remembered her ritual of keeping a small paper box by her bed, where she placed slips of paper with words she never said aloud. With teary eyes, he understood. It was his turn to do the same. He pulled a random piece of paper from his backpack and wrote, "Today, I chose not to react." Folded it with care. He didn't have a box yet, so he tucked it inside his wallet, beside an old ID card. It was the beginning of an invisible altar. When we choose silence, we're not stepping away from the world. We're finally meeting ourselves inside it. The days that followed came like gentler waves. Not because the world had quieted, but because he was no longer an anchor thrown into the storm. He discovered small ways to honor the silence that had begun to bloom. Each morning, before touching his phone, he sat at the edge of his bed and listened to his breath. At night, he wrote a single question in a new notebook, never needing the answer. That was enough. Quiet rituals unseen by anyone, yet steady enough to hold his soul in place. He returned to the house on the quiet street. Didn't know if it would still be there. To his surprise, the door was now locked, the windows covered. But he didn't feel sad. He smiled. The house had done its part. It wasn't meant to be refuge. It was passage. A place that exists only until we learn to carry that space within. He kept walking. With a simple gesture, he took the old notebook from his pocket and slipped it into a rusted mailbox, offering it to the unseen like a gift. That same day, he bought a small wooden box, lined it with a soft cloth, began placing his quiet notes inside. None would be read, none shared. Just words that, out of wisdom, no longer needed to be spoken. Phrases like, "I didn't enter the argument. I respected my timing. I didn't speak out of fear." Each paper, a vow of peace. Each fold, a brick in an invisible altar. Over time, his silence was no longer defensive, it became fertile. He began to truly hear others, not with anxious ears, but with an unarmed heart. And curiously, people spoke less around him, not from discomfort, but reverence. His silence reminded them of something they had forgotten. Not everything needs to be said to be felt. There are silences that don't push others away. Some silences hold like an embrace, and sometimes the soul finds its home within the act of listening. Months passed. The seasons changed their clothes. The world spun on in its restless dance, and he walked through it now like someone carrying a lantern lit from within. Not because he'd learned to escape the noise, but because he had found a place it could not reach. His silence was no longer delicate. It was rooted, built with choices unmade, with answers withheld, with pauses offered in place of reaction. Sitting on a stone bench by a gray lake, he held a small piece of paper in his hand. On it, one sentence written in his now softer handwriting, "Today, I didn't need to prove anything." He folded it gently, dug a small hole by the base of a tree and placed it in the earth like planting a sacred secret. Then he covered it with soil and closed his eyes. The breeze touched his face like a grandfather's hand calming an anxious child. And something in him settled. Life would keep shouting. The screens, the mouths, the fears disguised as certainty. But now he knew. He didn't have to defeat the noise. He only had to stop feeding it. He only had to remember where silence lived. And more than that silence wasn't a place to hide. It was a home for those who choose to listen to what the world forgot to say. So if today the world pulls at you, to explain, to respond, to prove, to please, withdraw. Write your non-reply on a slip of paper. Fold it like closing an inner window. Keep it in a box, or bury it, or burn it with intention. Make it your altar, not to escape, but to vow. A vow of peace. Because while everyone screams, you can be quiet inside, and there, in the deepest part of you, remember, what is true never has to shout. Mantra: not every answer needs to be spoken. Some reveal themselves when we go quiet. Symbolic ritual. For 7 days, write one unspoken answer each day. Fold each one in silence and place it somewhere sacred. Then choose. Plant it, burn it, or offer it to the wind. If this story planted something in you, return. There are more hidden paths for those who still know how to listen.